At its peak, Fletcher Jones and staff employed 3,000 people across 4 factories and 55 stores in every state in Australia. The workers owned the company. The factory at Warrnambool was surrounded by gardens so beautiful that tourists drove for hours to walk through them, and a silver ball water tower rose 40 metres above the city. For decades, if an Australian man needed trousers, he wore Fletcher Jones. Then the wall came down. Tariffs were cut, first by Whitlam in a single night, then by Hawke, Keating and Button on a schedule that took 30 years to complete. Imports flooded in from countries where workers earned 45 cents an hour. The cooperative was sold. The culture was gutted. The factory that once employed 1,300 people in Warrnambool closed with 12. Today the silver ball still glows over the city at night, but the sewing room is empty and the brand stopped trading in January 2026. This is the story of a stammering WWI veteran who built a factory on a rubbish dump, gave it to his workers, dressed a nation, and watched from the grave as the country decided it could buy its trousers cheaper somewhere else. Not a story about fashion. A story about what happens when the conditions that allow something humane to exist are quietly, methodically removed. Chapter 1. The Stammerer and the Hawker's Wagon. The story begins with a stammer. A young man standing in a Bendigo doorway, unable to finish a sentence, watching tailors work through shop windows because he couldn't walk in and ask them about their trade. David Fletcher Jones was born on the 14th of August, 1895 in Bendigo, Victoria. The 5th child of a Cornish blacksmith named Samuel Henry Jones and his wife Mahala, who'd been born in the colony. Mahala died when Fletcher was 2. Samuel remarried. The family lived in Golden Square, a suburb thick with Cornish mining families, people the Australian Dictionary of Biography described with characteristic precision as improving working class in social aspirations, Labour in politics, Methodist in religion. That phrase tells you almost everything. They believed in work, in God, and in the idea that tomorrow could be better than today if you put your back into it. Fletcher left school at 13. He spent 2 years in a Bendigo auction room, then 3 years breaking scrubland at Kangaroo Flat to establish a tomato farm for his father. He read everything he could find, and he read it aloud, hour after hour, alone, trying to bludgeon his stammer into submission. It never fully surrendered. But Fletcher Jones was not a man who waited for perfect conditions. On the 15th of July, 1915, he enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force. He was 20 years old, slight, stammering and determined. He sailed to Egypt, then to France with the 57th Battalion. And on the 19th of July, 1916, he walked into the Battle of Fromelles. Fromelles was a catastrophe. In a single night, the 5th Australian Division suffered 5,533 casualties, the bloodiest 24 hours in Australian military history. Jones was buried alive for several hours. He was dug out, evacuated to England with trench fever and what we'd now recognise as severe shell shock. When he was repatriated to Australia in 1917, his stammer had returned worse than before. The Army classified him C3, totally and permanently incapacitated, and discharged him on the 8th of February 1918. The repatriation doctors told him he'd have to speak or starve. He refused a war pension. He would support himself. That decision, pride wrapped in stubbornness, or stubbornness dressed as pride, set everything that followed in motion. Jones became a door-to-door salesman in Melbourne's inner suburbs, selling Manchester goods from house to house. The poverty he saw there, row after row of it, prejudiced him forever against cities. He wanted out, he wanted space, and he wanted to work for himself. In 1918, using a loan from the repatriation department, he bought a hawker's wagon. He stocked it with textiles from Flinders Lane, Melbourne's garment district, and headed for the bush. His early partner was Stan Clapton, his army cobber. They dreamed about this in the trenches, sheltering from shellfire in France, hawking goods through rural Victoria, free men on open roads. Together they formed Clapton and Jones and mapped a circuit through the Western District from Skipton to Terang, selling to shearers, farmers' wives and townsfolk who were grateful someone had brought the shop to them. The partnership dissolved. Jones worked alone. He bought trucks, hired shops for 3 monthly sales, erected marquees on vacant land and expanded into tailoring and dressmaking, pushing westward through the Otway Ranges and into South Australia. In 1922, he married Rena Ellen Jones, a childhood friend from Bendigo, and a coincidence of surnames at the Methodist Church in Golden Square. They'd have one daughter and two sons. 2 years later, in 1924, Jones bought a menswear and tailoring business in Warrnambool, a regional city on Victoria's southwest coast. It nearly killed the enterprise before it started. The location was poor, the town was conservative, the established retailers didn't want a hawker setting up shop. Within a few years, Jones was forced to come to an arrangement with his creditors, a polite way of saying he was staring at bankruptcy. He didn't fold. He adapted. He'd been a subscriber to Herbert Cassin's efficiency magazine since 1922, a stammering ex-soldier in regional Victoria, poring over American management theory by lamplight. He knew the ideas of Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, Frederick Taylor, Lillian Gilbreth. He started running daily specials, spot sales, competitions, techniques he'd lifted from American periodicals and planted in Western District soil. By 1928, he'd moved to a better shop near the corner of Liebig and Koroit streets. By 1931, he'd opened a purpose-built premises, retail downstairs, tailoring workshop above. He called it the man's shop. And then he did something no one expected. He threw himself into the town that had nearly rejected him. In 1927, he organised Warrnambool's winning entry in the Sun News Pictorial's Ideal Town contest. During the Depression, he collected and distributed TOC-H support for the unemployed and ran community singing nights that packed the hall. By 1939, his tailor's room was one of the largest in provincial Victoria, and the Melbourne creditors, who'd once wondered if they'd see their money again, had been repaid in full. Fletcher Jones had arrived from nowhere, a stammering, shell-shocked soldier with a hawker's wagon, and built himself a business through graft, ingenuity, and an American efficiency magazine. But the decision that would transform everything was still to come. Chapter 2. Nothing but trousers. In 1941, with the country at war again, Fletcher Jones made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He would make nothing but trousers. It sounds absurd. A single garment. But Jones had watched retailers for 2 decades, and what he'd seen offended him. Fractional sizing was ignored. Proper fitting was treated as an inconvenience. Men were sold trousers that didn't fit and told to live with it. Jones believed he could do better, and the Commonwealth Department of Supply gave him his chance, awarding him a contract for army pants during the Second World War. He developed the Coverdine work trouser, hard-wearing, practical, built for the blokes who actually wore them. Rural men loved it. By 1945, his Warrnambool rooms were supplying 123 retailers across 4 states. But the retailers themselves were the problem. They didn't care about fit the way Jones did. They didn't measure customers properly. They didn't stock the range of sizes that Jones knew mattered, so he cut them out entirely. On the 23rd of June 1946, Fletcher Jones opened his first retail shop at 435 Collins Street, Melbourne. Direct to the public, cash only, personal fittings for every customer. Signs in the window proclaimed, Fletcher Jones of Warrnambool, nothing but trousers. 72 scientific sizes. No man is hard to fit. The response was extraordinary. Queues stretched for blocks down Collins Street. An initial stock of 1,150 pairs was overwhelmed within days. Staff imposed limits, 1 to 2 pairs per customer, and still couldn't keep up. A stammering ex-soldier from Bendigo had opened a trouser shop in Melbourne's business district and caused a riot. 72 scientific sizes. That number is worth understanding because it tells you something about how Fletcher Jones thought. He didn't just make small, medium and large. He measured waists in half-inch increments, mapped leg lengths against body proportions, and created a sizing matrix that meant any man who walked through the door, short, tall, stout, thin, could walk out wearing trousers that actually fit him. In an era when most Australian men owned 2 pairs of trousers and wore them until they fell apart, this was revolutionary. It was also, in the quiet way that mattered most to Jones, respectful. Every man deserved clothes that fit. It didn't matter if he was a bank manager or a shearer. But the trouser revolution was only half of what Jones was building. The other half was stranger, more radical, and entirely his own. During the Depression, Jones had started asking himself a question that kept him up at night. Why were the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer? He wasn't an intellectual, he admitted as much. But he read, with self-confessed difficulty, the works of Victor Gollancz, Harold Lasky, J.B.S. Haldane, and Sidney and Beatrice Webb. He studied the history of the cooperative movement. Fabian socialism, eclectic, pragmatic, allergic to dogma, appealed to him more than anything else he'd encountered. The decisive influence came from an unexpected direction. In 1935, Jones arranged for Toyohiko Kagawa, a Japanese Christian pacifist who'd spent years living among the homeless in Tokyo's slums and pioneering cooperative enterprises, to speak at Warrnambool during an Australian lecture tour. The following year, Jones travelled to Japan for 5 months to study Kagawa's cooperative projects firsthand. He came home a changed man. He issued a statement he called Co-op Pie, influenced by Kagawa's book Brotherhood Economics. The core idea was simple and, to most businessmen of the era, certifiably insane. The workers should own the business. Jones described his emerging profit-sharing policy as a conscious attempt to establish a bridgehead between capitalism and socialism. When he took his plan to Neil Simons, a local Warrnambool solicitor, and asked for help structuring it, Simons told him he didn't need a business advisor. He needed a psychiatrist. But the dream, Simons later said, was so infectious that he not only set up the structure, but left his legal practice to work for Fletcher Jones. He'd serve as managing director for roughly 25 years before becoming chairman of directors. The original plan gave the Jones family 2/3 and staff 1/3, but Fletcher Jones surrendered his interest so readily that by the early 1950s, staff held 53% of shares. The man who'd built the business was giving it away, deliberately, methodically, and with absolute conviction that this was how things ought to work. In 1947, the company name changed to Fletcher Jones and staff peaty-linted. That ampersand wasn't decorative, it was a statement of principle, and it was about to be written into bricks and mortar. Chapter 3. A garden on a rubbish dump. In December 1947, Fletcher Jones bought 5 acres of Lawson's Quarry, a disused pit and rubbish dump on the eastern outskirts of Warrnambool, from the City Council for £430. It was the kind of land that nobody else wanted. He wanted it because he could see what it would become. The foundation stone was laid on the 21st of June 1948 by the Honourable J.J. Dedman, Minister for Post-War Reconstruction. But reconstruction in this case required improvisation. Post-war Australia was desperately short of building materials. You couldn't buy steel or timber for love nor money. So Jones sourced 17 war surplus army buildings from the military camp at Darley, near Bacchus Marsh, and had them trucked to Warrnambool. The architect was W.J.T. Walter, known as Tag, a local Warrnambool man who performed a small miracle of design. He took those military surplus structures and gave them a modernist facade that turned recycled army barracks into something that looked purpose-built. The post office building became the cutting room. The officer's mess, with its distinctive sawtooth roof, became the main sewing room. Aeroplane anchors and heavy airways, concrete blocks, were repurposed as garden fencing. In 1949, a US Army Quonset hut acquired from Milne Bay in Papua New Guinea was shipped down and added to house the after-sales department. A Quonset hut from the jungles of New Guinea, standing on what had been a rubbish dump in Warrnambool, making trousers for Australian men. If you'd written it as fiction, nobody would have believed it. Production commenced with 140 employees. Jones named the place Pleasant Hill, and then he started on the gardens. Garden work began in 1949, designed by Darby Boucher, Jones's brother-in-law, with assistance from Tag Walter. They expanded westward in 1951 and kept developing over the following decades. What emerged was unlike anything else in Australian industrial history. Manicured lawns, flower beds of annual bedding plants changed with the seasons, hedges clipped into geometric shapes with the precision of a military parade. Rockeries, pergolas covering the main entrance path. A sunken garden with a lily pond. A wishing well featuring a bell salvaged from a shipwreck off the Warrnambool coast, because of course it did. Large floral baskets of Castlemaine slate were added in 1955. Kentia palms, standard roses, contrasting foliage maintained to horticultural competition standard, year-round, at a working trouser factory. A peacock house was built in 1965. Fletcher Jones's original hawker's wagon was placed on display near the entrance. The thing that started it all, sitting amid the gardens of the enterprise it had funded. Jones's philosophy was characteristically direct. The effect which such an environment has on quality production is inestimable, and expressed in terms of our daily production, cost is infinitesimal. Beautiful surroundings cost almost nothing per trouser, But the pride they instilled in the people who worked there? He reckoned that was priceless. By the 1950s, Pleasant Hill was drawing thousands of visitors a year. Honeymooners used the gardens for wedding photographs. Tour buses stopped on the Prince's Highway. The Australian Dictionary of Biography called it a tourist mecca. Families drove for hours to walk through the gardens of a trouser factory. Try explaining that to someone under 40 and watch their face. Beneath the garden beds, tunnels were excavated under the building, eventually housing the first computer room in Warrnambool. Fletcher Jones had built a garden factory on a rubbish dump with army surplus buildings, and now he was running computers underground while peacocks strutted above. The expansion in these years was relentless. Adelaide in 1949, Geelong in 1950, Sydney and Hobart in 1952, a Queen Street Melbourne store in 1956. That same year, FJ won the contract to outfit the Australian women's team for the Melbourne Olympics. Betty Cuthbert, Lorraine Crapp and Dawn Fraser wore Fletcher Jones garments. Women's clothing production began, and suddenly the trouser company was dressing Olympic gold medalists. The Brunswick factory opened in 1959, needed because suit production had exhausted Warrnambool's supply of skilled labour. A second Brunswick factory followed in 1966. Mount Gambier in South Australia got a factory in 1971. By 1964, FJ had established Australia's first textile testing laboratory in the clothing industry, right there at Pleasant Hill. Computerized tailoring systems arrived in 1974, including a Gerber computer-driven cloth cutter in 1975, the sharpest edge of technology applied to the oldest of crafts. FJ became the largest Australian user of fine merino wool, sourcing it from the sheep stations of the Western District that surrounded Warrnambool. Wool from the paddocks you could see from the factory gates turned into trousers worn by men in every state and territory. The iconic +8 trouser style was developed by Lance Munday, an F.J. tailor who understood that men's bodies didn't conform to textbook proportions. The Fabrelastic comfort waist followed, and every garment came with a lifelong guarantee, free alterations and repairs for as long as you owned it. International partnerships were forged, Max Mara in Italy, Alexon in the UK. FJ outfitted Australian teams at the 1982 Brisbane Commonwealth Games, the 1986 Edinburgh Commonwealth Games, and the 1988 and 1992 Olympic Games. A trouser company from Warrnambool, dressing Australia on the world stage. Chapter 4. The FJ Family. What made Fletcher Jones genuinely different, what separated it from every other clothing company in Australia, wasn't the gardens or the sizing or the quality, though all of those mattered. It was the fact that the people who sewed the trousers owned the company that sold them. By the mid-1970s, staff held over 70% of shares, with the Jones family holding the remainder. By 1988, approximately 1,000 employees held $2.4 million worth of shares between them. The mechanics were unlike anything else in Australian business. Shares were sold to staff at nominal value and could only be traded at that value. There was no speculative profit to be made, no incentive to cash out and run. If you left before retirement, you sold your shares back to a company nominee. If you retired, you could keep them for life or leave them to your spouse. Each year, a portion of the company's dividend was distributed as a bonus that let staff buy more shares. A Fletcher Jones security fund, created in 1956, set aside profits as savings for permanent employees. The Victorian Heritage Register described the degree of staff involvement as unusual in the history of Australian business. That's heritage listing language for nobody else had done anything like it. The culture that grew from this ownership model was as distinctive as the structure itself. Managers and workers ate in the same dining room, queued in the same lunch line. Business decisions were made by cooperative teams. Factory sections operated on a team basis, not a hierarchical one. Daily do-you-know bulletins went out to all staff, part business communication, part community newsletter, blending production figures with personal announcements, birthdays with sales targets. They called themselves the FJ family, and unlike most companies that use that phrase, they meant it. Joy Billings, who worked as a receptionist at Pleasant Hill from 1973, described a workplace where the boundary between management and labour was deliberately blurred. People weren't interchangeable units on a production line. They were members of something. An attendance bonus of 60 cents, not much even then, motivated punctuality so effectively that workers would run to make it through the doors on time. not because they feared being docked, because they didn't want to let the team down. FJ reportedly never sacked staff. Workers who struggled in one role were redeployed to another. Jessie Rollo spent her career as an invisible mending specialist, repairing fabric flaws so seamlessly that no customer would ever know. George Dorian lived on site in staff housing. His daughter Marg grew up there, a child running through the gardens of a trouser factory, watching peacocks while her father worked inside. The factory floor at Pleasant Hill during the golden years was a place of particular texture. The main sewing room, the converted officer's mess with its sawtooth roof, was designed to flood the workspace with natural light, and it did. Row upon row of sewing machines, each operated by someone who knew the person on either side by name, who'd been to their children's birthday parties, who shared morning tea in the canteen. The sound was the steady mechanical chatter of industrial sewing machines, not the clanging violence of a steel mill, but a rhythmic, purposeful hum that you felt as much as heard. The smell was fabric. Bolts of fine merino wool being cut, pressed, stitched, and finished into garments that would last a decade if you looked after them. Walk through the cutting room, and you'd see the Gerber computer cutter, slicing through layers of cloth with a precision that human hands couldn't match. Walk through the pressing department, and the air was warm and damp, the steam presses giving each finished garment its final shape. Walk out through the gardens, and the contrast hit you. The clipped hedges, the flower beds, the lily pond, the peacocks, a factory that looked like a park and ran like a cooperative. Annual Christmas parties in the gardens became a beloved tradition, the kind of event that former workers still talk about decades later. The FJ Stories Project, a community history effort led by Julie Eagles and Tonya Wilcox, has gathered thousands of photographs and oral histories from former employees. It won the Victorian Community History Award in 2017 and in October 2025 presented to over 100 people at Warrnambool's Lighthouse Theatre. The memories are vivid, specific, and almost universally warm. People don't just remember working at Fletcher Jones, they remember belonging to it. Chapter 5. The Man in the Two-Bedroom Bungalow. At its peak, Fletcher Jones and staff operated 55 retail stores across 6 states and the ACT. It employed between 2,700 and 3,000 people across 4 factories and the retail network. Stores stood in every Australian capital city and most major regional towns. The Warrnambool factory alone employed over 1,100 workers, in a city whose total population barely exceeded 25,000. For decades, if an Australian man needed trousers for work, for a wedding, for a funeral, for any occasion that required him to look presentable, he wore Fletcher Jones. The Australian Dictionary of Biography's judgment is unequivocal. Arguably, no single person or firm had done more to transform and, for a time, homogenise Australian dress standards, particularly among men, than Fletcher Jones and his staff. That assessment landed in 1996. By then, most of what it described was already gone. But in the years when the enterprise was at full stretch, Warrnambool was an FJ town in every sense that mattered. The factory was the largest employer. Its wages circulated through the shops on Liebig Street, the pubs, the churches, the footy club. When FJ workers knocked off for the day, their children were in schools funded by the rates those wages generated. Their houses, modest, well-kept within driving distance of Pleasant Hill, formed the residential backbone of the city's eastern growth. For Warrnambool, FJ wasn't just an employer. It was civic infrastructure. The FJ Foundation, established in December 1958, became the vehicle for Jones's philanthropy, funding community organisations, supporting local initiatives, running what would become the Geelong Contemporary Art Prize, a biennial $30,000 acquisitive painting prize that has been operating since 1938. The Fletcher Jones Family Foundations remain active in Warrnambool to this day. And the man who'd built all of it? Sir Fletcher Jones, knighted in the 1974 New Year Honours for services to decentralisation of industry and the community, lived in a 2-bedroom bungalow near Pleasant Hill. He drove a 1962 Rover 2000. He didn't smoke. He didn't drink. He was gregarious, affable, fond of aphorisms that his workers repeated for decades after his death. What you say whispers, what you do thunders. It is better to start without a plan than plan without a start. The knighthood, the ADB noted, was long delayed, believed to be because Liberal-era governments were uneasy about his clear labour sympathies and his alternative business practices. A worker-owned cooperative in regional Victoria, run by a Fabian socialist who'd studied Japanese communitarian economics. It didn't fit neatly into any political box. The Liberals couldn't quite bring themselves to honour him. Labour couldn't quite claim him as their own. Jones occupied a space that Australian politics didn't have a name for, somewhere between capitalism and socialism, between profit and purpose, between boss and worker. He published his autobiography in 1976, not by myself, bound, characteristically, in imitation coverdine. The title was a statement of everything he believed. He hadn't done it alone. He'd done it with his staff. And then, in 1967, his eldest son Ralph designed the thing that every Australian who ever drove the Princes Highway past Warrnambool would remember for the rest of their life: the silver ball. Standing 40 metres tall, the elevated steel tripod supporting a spherical steel tank was built as part of Pleasant Hill's fire protection and water booster system. The restricted site didn't allow for a traditional four-legged base, so Ralph Jones devised the distinctive tripod design. Painted silver with orange-red legs, it rose above the factory, above the gardens, above the city itself. The Victorian Heritage Register describes it as a distinctive and visible feature, the design of which transforms a structure performing a utilitarian function into a structure of landmark prominence. That's the official language. The unofficial language, the language of every kid who pressed their face against the back window of their parents' Kingswood as it sailed past on the highway, was simpler. Look, the silver ball. It was Warrnambool's Eiffel Tower, its opera house, a water tank that became a landmark because the family that built it couldn't help making even the functional things beautiful. Chapter 6. The Summit. They couldn't see past. By the mid-1970s, Fletcher Jones and staff sat at the apex of Australian clothing manufacturing. 55 stores, 4 factories, 3,000 employees. The cooperative model was working at a scale that would have been dismissed as fantasy when Jones first pitched it to Neil Simons 3 decades earlier. The company wasn't just surviving as a worker-owned enterprise, it was thriving, expanding, winning Olympic contracts, exporting partnerships to Italy and Britain. The system that made all of this possible had a name, though the workers at Pleasant Hill rarely used it: tariff protection. Since 1871, when Victoria's colonial government first introduced tariffs to protect local manufacturing, imported clothing had been priced out of the Australian market. By the mid-1970s, the effective rate of assistance for clothing and footwear had reached 87%, meaning imported garments were taxed so heavily that Australian-made alternatives were virtually the only viable option. Manufacturing employed a quarter of the national workforce. Its share of GDP sat around 25 to 30%. The tariff wall was the foundation beneath every factory floor in the country. For Fletcher Jones specifically, the wall was existential. The company used the finest local merino wool. It employed Australian workers at Australian wages. It sold through its own retail stores with personal fittings, lifelong guarantees and free repairs. Every element of its cost structure depended on imports being priced out of competition. Without the tariff wall, the arithmetic didn't work. With it, the arithmetic was magnificent. And between 1974 and 1985, that wall actually got higher. The effective rate for clothing and footwear rose from 87% to an extraordinary 250%, achieved through tariff increases, quota arrangements, and import restrictions. This was the environment in which FJ reached its absolute peak. Maximum protection, maximum employment, maximum confidence. Sir Fletcher Jones died on the 22nd of February, 1977, in Warrnambool, aged 81. He was buried alongside his first wife, Raina. His estate was sworn for probate at $326,795. Modest for a man who'd built one of the largest clothing companies in the world. Neil Simons said of him, "He never acquired riches. He never lived the life of a rich man, and finally, all he worked for, he handed over to a trust." He left behind a factory on a rubbish dump that had become a tourist attraction, gardens that drew thousands of visitors a year, a silver ball visible from every corner of the city, a cooperative that employed 3,000 people and had proved, for 45 years and counting, that workers could own the means of production and turn a profit doing it. He also left behind a business that depended entirely on a wall that other people controlled. And those people were already talking about bringing it down. Chapter 7. The wall comes down, 3% at a time. The first blow landed on the 18th of July, 1973. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam announced that from midnight that same day, all tariffs would be cut by 25% across the board. No consultation with industry, no phased adjustment, no warning. The decision had been planned in secret by a 6-person committee chaired by Tariff Board head Alf Radigan. It was the first such cut in Australian history. Manufacturing employment fell by 80,000 over the next 7 years. For the textile, clothing and footwear industries, the immediate damage was partially reversed. Governments restored protection for what they called sensitive industries within 2 years. But the precedent had been set. The wall could be lowered. The wall had been lowered. And the people who lowered it weren't the opposition. They were Labor. That political detail matters. The tariff wall that kept FJ's workers employed had been maintained by governments of both persuasions for the better part of a century. When Labor began dismantling it, the sting cut differently from anything Fletcher Jones's workers had experienced before. This wasn't the boss against the worker. This was their own side making a calculation that their jobs were a cost the country could no longer afford. The systematic dismantling came a decade later, and it came from Labor again. On the 12th of December 1983, Treasurer Paul Keating floated the Australian dollar, removing the fixed exchange rate that had provided a further layer of insulation for local manufacturers. The float was technically about monetary policy. In practice, it was the second wall coming down. The exchange rate could now move with the market, and when tariffs were cut, the dollar was supposed to adjust downward, softening the blow. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. For manufacturers who'd built their entire cost structure around a protected fixed-rate economy, the ground was shifting beneath their feet. Then came the man who would reshape Australian industry more profoundly than any minister, before or since. Senator John Button, born in Ballarat, a lawyer by training from Maurice Blackburn and Company, Minister for Industry, Technology and Commerce from 1983 to 1993, was methodical, intelligent and utterly convinced that Australian manufacturing could not survive behind tariff walls forever. His approach was what he called a judicious mixture of carrot and stick. Productivity improvements from unions in return for job protection. Anti-dumping measures in return for investment in modernisation, the TCF plan, announced in 1986 and effective from March 1989, combined tariff reductions with $150 million for research, development and retraining. The logic was reasonable. The tariff wall had made Australian clothing expensive. Consumers were paying more for locally made garments than they would for imports. Families on tight budgets were subsidising factory workers' wages through higher prices at the checkout. Button believed, and the Productivity Commission's economists agreed, that a managed reduction in protection, coupled with investment in modernisation, could produce an industry that was leaner, more competitive, and ultimately more sustainable than one propped up behind a wall. The logic was reasonable, the consequences were devastating. The decisive blow came in 1991 with the statement "Building a Competitive Australia," authored by Hawke, Keating and Button. This legislated the end. All TCF quotas would be terminated in 1993. Tariffs would be phased down to a maximum of 25% by the year 2000. Most general tariffs were reduced to 5% by 1996. The wall that had stood for over a century was being dismantled on a published schedule, year by year, percentage point by percentage point. Under the Howard government, a tariff pause froze TCF rates from 2000 to 2005, but reductions resumed to 17.5% in 2005, 10% in 2010, and finally a uniform 5% by 2015. A $747 million TCF strategic investment program was meant to cushion the transition. For companies like Fletcher Jones, a worker-owned cooperative in regional Victoria, making high-quality garments from Australian merino wool, employing Australian workers at Australian wages, it was not remotely enough. Because while the wall was coming down on one side, the competition was pouring through on the other. Cheap clothing imports surged, first from South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong and Taiwan in the 1970s and 1980s. Then from the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand and Malaysia. then with a force that dwarfed everything that came before, from China, Bangladesh, Vietnam and Pakistan. The labour cost differential was not a gap, it was a chasm. Australian textile workers earned approximately $10 to $12 an hour. Workers in China, Indonesia, Pakistan and Vietnam earned under 45 cents an hour in US currency. Not $10 to $12 against 8 or 9, $10 to $12 against 45 cents. No amount of efficiency, innovation or worker commitment could bridge that difference. Not for FJ, not for anyone. By 2001, imports' share of Australian clothing had grown from 19% to 45%. Since 2005, China has been Australia's largest merchandise import source. Today, only about 3% of clothes sold in Australia are made in this country. And while the tariffs were falling and the imports were rising, the market itself was turning away from the very thing Fletcher Jones had spent 50 years perfecting. The shift from formal to casual business wear, accelerated by Casual Friday spreading from Silicon Valley in the 1990s, eroded demand for precisely fitted trousers and tailored suits. The fragmentation of men's fashion from the 1960s onwards shattered the economies of scale that had underpinned FJ's model. Fast fashion, weekly range turnover, disposable pricing, global supply chains was the antithesis of everything Fletcher Jones had built. A lifelong guarantee means nothing to a customer who plans to throw the garment away in 6 months. FJ was caught in a vice. The tariff wall that had protected it was being legislated out of existence. The imports flooding through the gap were made by workers earning a fraction of Australian wages, and the product it had built its reputation on, the well-made, precisely fitted, enduring men's trouser, was falling out of fashion. Any one of those forces might have been survivable together. They were fatal. Chapter 8. The cooperative dies on a Wednesday. Sir Fletcher Jones had been dead for just over a year when the bleeding began at Pleasant Hill. But the first visible wounds didn't appear until 1989, 12 years after the founder's passing, and the same year Senator Button's TCF plan took effect. Jones's son, David Fletcher Jones, educated at Warrnambool Primary School and Geelong Grammar, deputy chairman since 1975, managing director since 1979, had inherited the enterprise and the cooperative values that came with it. Staff still held over 70% of shares. The store network had expanded to 55 outlets. The 1970s and 1980s had been described as the golden years. But David Jones lacked his father's moral authority, not through any failing of his own, but because that kind of authority can't be inherited. It has to be earned over decades, through the accumulation of trust that comes from building something from nothing. Sir Fletcher had that. No successor could. In June 1989, 75 workers at Warrnambool were retrenched. It was the first mass retrenchment in the company's history. In February 1991, another 17 were let go. The remaining staff accepted a 4-day working week. They worked 4 days a week for almost 11 months, nearly a full year of shortened weeks, shortened pay, the factory running at 3/4 capacity while the tariff reductions ground on, and the imports kept coming. They briefly resumed full-time work in early 1992. It didn't last. On the 27th of October 1992, working hours slumped to 3 days a week. The Warrnambool factory that had once employed over 1,300 people was hemorrhaging jobs, and everybody inside those gates knew it. FJ Chairman John Blood acknowledged publicly that support from major suppliers, creditors, banks, and the Victorian and South Australian governments was keeping the company alive. That sentence deserves to be read carefully. The worker-owned cooperative that had proved a Fabian socialist's dream could work at scale, that had operated for 45 years without sacking a single employee, was now surviving on the charity of its creditors and the intervention of 2 state governments. The sale came in December 1992. Fletcher Jones and staff was purchased by the Australian Apparel Company, formed by shareholders of Pellico Petty Lillhit. Chairman Tim Mulvaney stated that the FJ and Pellico businesses would run independently. The sale ended the involvement of the Jones family. David Jones and the FJ Foundation had controlled about 27% of the group. Staff and former employees held the rest. Worker shares were bought out as part of the corporate sale. The cooperative, the thing that had made Fletcher Jones unlike any other company in Australian history, was dead. Joy Billings watched it happen from the inside. She'd been a receptionist at Pleasant Hill since 1973, part of the FJ family for 20 years. Her account of what followed the sale is the most devastating testimony in the entire Fletcher Jones record. The executive production manager asked management to reduce total staff by 60 people as we were to move to a more flexible workforce. The outcome was people who had only one particular skill or people who had any disability were retrenched, even if they had 40 years of service. It seemed there was no compassion allowed on the day these staff were to leave. It felt to me like people were rounded up like cattle, given their pay, and then told to leave the factory. The chaplains were not invited to be in attendance. This was not the way of Fletcher Jones. That last sentence. This was not the way of Fletcher Jones. A woman who had watched the old culture from the inside, measuring what replaced it against what had been there before, and finding it unrecognisable. The Brunswick factory closed by June 1993, 80 workers made redundant, 9 retail outlets shut. The new owners were doing what new owners do, cutting costs, rationalising operations, applying the arithmetic of conventional business to an enterprise that had never been conventional. They weren't villains. They were business people who'd bought a struggling company and were trying to make it work in a market that was turning hostile by the quarter. But the thing that had made FJ worth saving, the cooperative culture, the shared ownership, the principle that workers and management were partners rather than adversaries, couldn't survive corporate logic. It wasn't an asset on the balance sheet. It couldn't be valued, restructured, or leveraged. And so it was discarded, the way you discard anything that doesn't fit the spreadsheet. In April 1992, months before the sale, the Warrnambool City Council had done something remarkable. Facing the potential loss of the city's largest employer, the council purchased the Pleasant Hill factory site for $750,000 and leased it back to FJ to preserve the remaining approximately 350 jobs and save the heritage gardens. A local council spending $750,000 to buy a trouser factory. That's what FJ meant to Warrnambool. That's the measure of what was at stake. Chapter 9. The Last 12. In 1995, when what remained of Fletcher Jones was about to be closed, a man named Ted Dimmick stepped in. Dimmick was the founder of Geelong Textiles. His family had owned the Geelong Textile Group since 1971. He and his partner Peter Porswang bought the business and kept the brand alive, but the direction was clear. Manufacturing was increasingly shifted offshore. The factory at Pleasant Hill continued in diminished form, but it was no longer the beating heart of the enterprise. It was a remnant, a handful of workers in a building designed for over 1,000, surrounded by gardens that were harder and harder to justify maintaining. Ted Dimmick died on the 26th of June, 2008. He was described as the last of the merchant venturers, a phrase that captured something true about the kind of businessman who'd tried to save a cooperative trouser factory in regional Victoria when every market signal was telling him to let it go. The Dimmick family continued to own Fletcher Jones after his death, but the factory couldn't hold. The Warrnambool factory's last years were a slow diminishment. From over 1,300 workers at peak, employment dwindled through the hundreds, past the dozens, to a figure that would have been unimaginable to anyone who'd walked through those gates in the 1960s. On the 24th of November 2005, manufacturing ceased at Pleasant Hill. The remaining staff numbered 12 people, in a factory built for 1,300, on a site that had drawn thousands of tourists a year to its gardens. Beneath a silver ball, visible across the entire city, they were dismissed. The machines stopped. The sewing room, the converted officers' mess that Tag Walter had given a modernist facade in 1948, where row upon row of workers had stitched trousers from Australian merino wool for more than half a century, fell silent. The factory that Fletcher Jones had built from army surplus on a rubbish dump, surrounded by gardens designed by his brother-in-law, watched over by a silver ball designed by his son, was empty. What followed was a grim convergence of endings. David Fletcher Jones, the founder's son, who'd spent 39 years at FJ and managed the family foundations after leaving the company, died at Port Fairy Hospital on the 6th of December 2011, aged 76. His wife Isabel had died just 9 to 10 weeks earlier. 36 hours after David's death, on the 8th of December 2011, Fletcher Jones and staff was placed into administration. Administrators from Core Cordis, led by partner Bruno Secatore, took control of more than 40 stores. The business had turned over more than $24 million in the 2011 financial year, but had collapsed under more than $8 million in debt, about half of it owed to the Dimmock family's Geelong textiles. On the 14th of December, 15 stores were closed immediately. 61 employees were made redundant, 53 retail workers and 8 head office staff, at a cost of approximately $600,000 in entitlements. Stores closed in Victoria, New South Wales, the ACT, Queensland, South Australia and Western Australia. The closures swept through the country like a hand wiping pins off a map. 30 stores remained open temporarily. At the Warrnambool retail outlet, the last shop standing in the town where it all began, only 2 staff remained. John Hogan, the store manager, had worked for Fletcher Jones for more than 43 years. His colleague was Colleen Gurry. Between them, they represented something close to a century of service. Hogan said simply that the closure was a sign of the times. The media coverage was extensive. The Sydney Morning Herald ran headlines including "Fletcher Jones woes blamed on China" and "Irrelevant fashion undoes Fletcher Jones." The Australian Financial Review declared Fletcher Jones runs out of time. The Age reached for the phrase that captured everything. Fletcher Jones, from rags to riches. To rags. Chapter 10. What grew back? After the factory fell silent in 2005, the gardens began to die. Not immediately. Gardens don't work that way. They fade. The beds that had been replanted seasonally went unplanted. The hedges that had been clipped into geometric precision grew shaggy, then wild. The lily pond silted up. The peacocks were gone. The pergolas along the main entrance path weathered and buckled. Under Warrnambool's coastal climate, the salt air, the winter rains, the summer heat, decades of meticulous horticulture began to unravel in a matter of years. A small band of volunteers, led by a man named Lex Caldwell, kept the gardens alive during the worst of the neglect. Caldwell and his group worked without pay, without resources, and largely without recognition, pruning, weeding, watering, holding back the decay through sheer stubbornness. It was, in its own quiet way, the most Fletcher Jones thing imaginable, people looking after something because it mattered, not because anyone was paying them to. In May 2014, a Geelong-based property investor named Dean Montgomery purchased the Pleasant Hill site for approximately $1.3 million and invested millions more in restoration. He repurposed the buildings for office, retail and warehouse use, generating roughly $350,000 in annual rental income, and planned a motor museum. The heritage-listed factory buildings survive: the original canteen, the central tower remnant, the original sewing room, the round room, the Bristol building. The gardens are publicly accessible again. A Fletcher Jones market, collectibles, antiques, retro clothing, operates at the site. In August 2018, Warrnambool artist Glenn Morgan exhibited 44 wooden relief artworks depicting the Fletcher Jones story at the restored factory. The building that once made trousers now displays art about making trousers. The Silver Ball still stands. In its 50th year, in 2017, the tower received a major restoration and was permanently lit up on the Warrnambool skyline, to the delight of locals who'd feared its loss. The entire site, factory, gardens and water tower, was listed on the Victorian Heritage Register in August 2006, described as being of historical, social and aesthetic significance. The Gowdy family of Melbourne purchased the Fletcher Jones brand from administration. Matthew Gowdy became managing director and relaunched the business online on the 22nd of March 2013, subsequently opening stores including one at 447 Collins Street, near FJ's original 1946 shop. The brand survived another 13 years. On the 18th of January 2026, Fletcher Jones announced the closure of all remaining stores and its online presence by the end of the month. Matthew Gowdy stated plans to sell the brand. The company's farewell message was, "It's not goodbye, it's see you soon." The closure came days after another Australian brand, Sass and Bide, also shut down, both casualties of weakening discretionary spending, rising costs and retail habits that had shifted beyond recovery. The Fletcher Jones brand, as of early 2026, has effectively ceased trading. It exists only as a name awaiting a buyer. Fletcher Jones's fate was not unique. The textile, clothing and footwear industry lost catastrophically across the board. Full-time TCF employment peaked at 115,641 in August 1989, the same year Button's plan took effect. and fell to an all-time low of 15,961 by February 2023. Between 1989 and 1995 alone, the union reported 10,655 retrenchments. Manufacturing's share of GDP declined from 30% in the 1960s to 12% by 2007. The names read like a roll call of the dead. Bonds, founded 1915, 7 factories closed, 1,850 jobs cut in 2009, sold to the American company Hanesbrands for $800 million. Hard Yakka, founded 1935 in Brunswick, sold to Wesfarmers. King G, established Sydney 1926, manufacturing moved offshore 2009. Polaco, the same Polaco whose shareholders bought and dismantled FJ's cooperative, established 1906, once employing 1,500 people in 10 factories, vacated its landmark Richmond factory in 1988. No longer manufactures in Australia. The documentary The Fabric of a Dream, the primary screen record of the Fletcher Jones story, produced by Melodrama Pictures with Film Australia and aired on SBS from 2007, framed the loss explicitly. The history of Fletcher Jones and his clothing business is a microcosm of what has happened in the steel industry and the car industry, right across the textile, clothing and footwear industries and on farms. The tariff reforms that destroyed FJ were not irrational. Government estimates suggest Australian families saved over $1,000 a year from tariff reductions. Cheaper clothing, wider choice, lower prices at the register. Those gains were real, but they were distributed invisibly. A few dollars here, a few dollars there across millions of households. The losses were concentrated. They landed on Warrnambool, on Brunswick, on Mount Gambier, on every regional town and suburban factory floor where people had built their lives around making things. The savings were silent. The losses had names. Chapter 11. The Silver Ball at Night. Warrnambool Mayor Ben Blaine offered the closest thing to a summary in 2025. If the essence of what Warrnambool is and what we value was ever embodied within a single person, it was Sir Fletcher Jones. The story of Fletcher Jones is also the story of Warrnambool, which is in turn the story of mid-20th century Australia. A stammering soldier came back from France with nothing but a hawker's wagon and a refusal to accept a pension. He read American efficiency magazines by lamplight and Japanese cooperative theory in his spare time. He made nothing but trousers, and he made them better than anyone else in the country. He built a factory on a rubbish dump and turned it into a tourist attraction. He gave the business to the people who worked in it, lived in a 2-bedroom bungalow while they built it into one of the largest clothing companies in the world, and died with an estate that wouldn't have bought a house in Melbourne's inner suburbs. His workers held shares that couldn't be speculated on. They ate in the same dining room as their managers. They ran to clock on, not because they feared punishment, but because they didn't want to let the team down. They made garments that lasted a decade, from wool grown in the paddocks they could see from the factory gates, and they guaranteed every stitch for life. The wool came down. The imports came in. The cooperative was sold. The workers were rounded up like cattle, Joy Billings' words, not mine, and sent home. The factory fell silent. The gardens died and were brought back by volunteers. The brand changed hands, changed again, and finally, in January 2026, stopped trading altogether. The silver ball still glows over Warrnambool at night. Restored in its 50th year, permanently lit, visible from the highway where families once slowed down so the kids in the back seat could get a better look. It was built as a water tank for a fire protection system. It became a landmark. Now it's a memorial, though nobody has called it that. The gardens are tended, the building's house offices, and a market. Fletcher Jones's hawker's wagon still sits on the site where he parked it decades ago, the first thing he ever owned, surrounded by the last thing he ever built. The trousers are gone.